We're going to go ahead and get started. But before we do, I encourage you to introduce yourselves in the chat. Feel free to include your name, your pronouns, the year you graduated, and your current city. And we're going to copy and paste that into the chat as well for easy access. Hi everyone. I'm Kamrie Risku. I use she, her pronouns. And I'm the coordinator for curriculum and partnerships in the Office of Leadership and Community Service Learning here at the University of Maryland. And I'm also a TERP alum. I graduated in 2020 with my Master of Education in Student Affairs. And I'm joined today here with our lovely panelists who will introduce themselves shortly, and LCSL's Assistant Director, Courtney Holder. And if you have any questions or concerns about anything, feel free to send her a chat. She'll be able to help. She is doing all the magic behind the Zoom today. So we're really grateful for that. So we're excited that you're able to join us today during your lunch hour, perhaps, for Fearlessly Forward, a conversation on current realities and future directions in leadership. And this panel is brought to you by the Alumni Association's Career Week. And this is a week-long virtual event series to help alumni like you advance your career, elevate your expertise, and connect with fellow Terps. I'm sure you all have joined other events this week, but there are still 2 more days to go. So I encourage you to check out their website and join some more events. And you probably have already seen that this webinar will be recorded. And so by participating, you acknowledge and consent to your image and likeness or voice being recorded. And for those of you that want to use closed captioning, please just click the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom panel. So let's get started. We have a lot of info to cover today, but and we'll have an opportunity for the panelists to address questions at the end of the webinar. But at any point in the conversation, feel free to submit a question using that chat feature at the bottom of the Zoom panel, and we'll moderate those and include them at the end. So on behalf of the LCSL office, I want to thank you for just taking your time out of your day to talk to these awesome scholars and educators, but most importantly, TERP alums. So in a moment, our panelists will set the stage and share a little bit about themselves and how they came to work in the leadership education field. But before we begin, I just want to share some hopes for our time that we have together today. Really, that being that we're going to spend about 40 minutes highlighting some of those contemporary trends in leadership practices, and Dr. Skendall, Pierre, and Owen will share their insights and hopes for the future leadership practice. And so we have about 5 questions for them, but we're going to save those last 10 to 15 minutes for questions from the audience. So feel free to use that chat feature, as I mentioned. So let's go ahead and actually just get started. And so in any order, please tell us a little bit about yourself and how you found yourself in this work.
I will kick us off. My name is Dr. Darren Pierre. My pronouns are he, him, his, and it is such a pleasure and honor to be here with you. So I want to thank Cam and Courtney for the invitation to be here and to be with 2 people who I just celebrate every opportunity I can, Dr. Owen and Dr. Skendall. So for me, I came to this work and I came to this space growing up in North Carolina, and so that's where I consider home. I came into leadership haphazardly. I came to the University of Maryland like you all did, and I felt like I couldn't leave this space without taking a class with Susan Comabez. I just felt like at the time, Susan Comabez was a professor, and at the time the College and Personnel Program, and she is a leading leadership scholar. So I was going to take this leadership class because that's what you would have to do here at Maryland. And I was going to audit the class. Because I already had a full schedule, and at that time, I did not value learning at the full level I probably should. Anyways, I came to the class not really seeing myself as the leader and not feeling like I belonged in that conversation. And I left that space. Ironically, Susan didn't teach that class. It was Dr. Owen who taught that class because Susan, I believe, was on sabbatical. And I left that class knowing that not only am I part of the leadership conversation, but I have a responsibility to give a powerful invitation to others who may not have felt like they belonged in that space. Given my identities, given my lived experiences, I just felt like I didn't fit what John Dugan talks about as the prototype or the archetype of what it means to be a leader. And leaving that academic space, it has informed my work professionally. It has informed the activities I get involved in, because I think we all have a role in agitating spaces to be a little bit more inclusive. And for me, the spaces that I have elected to agitate are those spaces of leadership, learning, and development. So that's a little bit about me and how I got to this work.
Hi, everyone. My name is Julie Owen. We were laughing because we don't want to go out. Kristan and I were debating. We didn't want to go after Darren. Darren has a way with words. He's probably my most cited person when I give talks because he's got so many powerful aphorisms and sayings that I tend to use. So thank you, Darren, for your constant contribution. So honored to be here today with many amazing Maryland alums. I came to leadership through community service. So I went to the College of William and Mary down the road, as did Kristan, you'll probably hear momentarily, and was very involved in trying to fix the problems of the world, a very idealistic young person. And leadership wasn't a thing. I think I'm the most senior age-wise on the panel here by several years. So there wasn't a sort of formal academic study of leadership at that time. And so I was doing all of this service work, starting with sort of helping on to people versus actually learning about reciprocity and community engagement, those kinds of things. And then someone said, oh, you're doing leadership. And I said, oh, no. Leadership is the man. I also was a women's studies minor. So I was taking a lot of feminist courses and had a sort of gendered view of leadership, a very hierarchical view of leadership. So I had a resistance story when I came to leadership. And then our Dean of Students, Sam Sadler from the College of William and Mary, handed me a document that was a printout back in the day of the social change model of leadership. And he said, Julie, there's some people talking about what if we rethink leadership as it being about people working together to change the world for the better. And I had a road to Damascus moment where I was very, I drank the Kool-Aid and really sort of came to leadership through community service. So that's my brief story. Right now, I'm a faculty member at George Mason University in Virginia, and I have the great joy of teaching courses, both undergrad and graduate courses in leadership and in community-based research and civic engagement. And if you want to have a fun conversation on any plane or at a bar, tell people you teach leadership, because they will argue, can you teach it? Should we teach it? And my response is always, well, we certainly have leadership crises, and the world is in need of inclusive, emancipatory leadership. So I'm going to try my best to teach it, whether people think they can or not. So that's a brief about me. I'm going to turn it over to Kristan.
Should have thought about this and jumped in first, so I didn't have to follow both of you. It's so nice to be here. Thank you, Cam and Courtney, for the invitation, and what a joy to join my friends and colleagues, Julie and Darren. My name is Kristan Cilente Skendall. I use she, her pronouns. I am also a graduate of the College Student Personnel Program, now Student Affairs concentration in the College of Education from 2012, which feels like yesterday, but sadly is not, more than a decade ago. I, like Julie, went to William and Mary, and even in high school, I think I came to leadership through a responsibility to community and feeling like I can do something to be a contributor, whether that was in student government or as a resident assistant. And so I kind of always gravitated towards opportunities to give back and contribute to any organization of which I was a part. And no one ever called that leadership. I am a firstborn, and so I think I would often have a feeling of responsibility towards others, and that would show up in a way that folks might call bossy or commanding, and therefore was assigned a word leader sometimes, and never really thought of myself in that way. And then when I was going to graduate school, I needed a job to help support my tuition and apartment and rent, and really wanted to stay in the world of residence life. I wanted to be a resident director. I thought that would be a wonderful way to serve and learn and be in community with others and make a difference. And I didn't get the job, which was such a happy, wonderful accident, because the office in the student union at University of Arizona needed someone to help with leadership through a program that they had just started at the time. And I applied and really connected with the folks. And that was really my first introduction to leadership. Since then, I've been able to teach and write and practice this work of expansive, inclusive leadership as a process, not as a position. And feel that that responsibility is still a thread, but for me now, it's this responsibility to help expand how we think about leadership and who and what and how leadership can show up in the organizations in which I am a part. Cam.
Thank you for sharing that. And Kristan, I love that piece about, kind of being labeled as bossy. I was an older sister and, or am an older sister. And I think my siblings would say that I'm very bossy. And so it feels like a good connection point for me in the work that I do. So I appreciate you sharing that. And I love you all talking a little bit about that transformative piece, how the years have changed, how you see leadership and leadership practice and development. And as I mentioned earlier, you all are, researchers and scholars and practitioners and educators and authors in leadership education. And so I really want to know, and I'm sure others do as well, how some of those experiences you've had, maybe being called bossy or not getting the job and being landing up somewhere that maybe you didn't really necessarily intend. So how have some of those experiences transformed how you define and practice leadership over the years?
Can I go first with this one? Cam, I just want to follow up. There is amazing a movement called Ban Bossy that's I just wanted to add this to our conversation. Based on a study the Girl Scouts did of both people who identify still binary, but as boys and girls. They sort of hadn't gotten the inclusive gender language at that point. But that's one of the few actual sort of large scale studies of girls in leadership. And they asked them, why they didn't take it on leadership roles. And one of the biggest responses was, I didn't want people to think I was bossy. Right. So this fear of stepping forward, this fear of having voice, and there's obviously gendered elements in that. So just interesting that both you and Kristan shared that. And so they've started a social media movement called Ban Bossy. And what if we labeled that as leadership? What if we, obviously we don't want everybody to go around only telling each other what to do and not sort of listening to other people's inputs and experiences. But
Julie, is that band, B-A-N-D? Or ban, B-A-N, because I've now had this image of a musical group performing.
No, B-A-N, ban, hashtag ban bossy. I think you can look it up on Twitter and see if that's still active. But I think that's a cool idea, getting people to rethink leadership. So just wanted to add that. Your question was, how have our views of leadership changed over the years, I think, right? So as I said, I really moved from this idea of I wanted to be a servant first, and you probably, many people on the call may have heard of servant leadership. And then sort of realizing if you are just doing community work and you're not sort of taking chances to sort of work in coalition with people to address, if you're just sort of addressing symptomatic causes and not taking a systemic view, then maybe you're not being as effective as you could in change making. And so this view that you have to, in my mind, you really, if you want to be effective in solving the needs of the world, you have to incorporate leadership in it. And so kind of being more and more convinced that these are two sides of the same coin, and we need all of the sort of tools in our tool belt for change making. And then just to kind of say, if you're at all a student of leadership, you'll realize that it's gotten increasingly complex. So much so that our most current theories of leadership are complexity leadership theory. So we just put it in the title of what we're trying to do. And I think that we're getting closer. We're getting closer in understanding that it's not one simple thing. We need head and heart, and we need sort of multiple levers to make change in the world. So I'll stop there, but just ban bossy hashtag.
And band bossy too. I like that. I'm going to jump in before Darren here because we have to take turns of who follows him. Like Julie, I think my feelings around leadership have become more complex in many ways. I think when I first came to this work, first of all, I didn't know that there were theories of leadership. I didn't know that folks had researched and studied this. And so I, as a 22-year-old recent college grad, got thrown in to teach a leadership course at the University of Arizona. And I thought, who let me do this or thought it was a good idea? And continued to learn with the students. And so at starting point, I really thought about, well, a leader does these things. It's a person, it's individual. Maybe you can learn, maybe not. Maybe it's born. So some of the trait theory pieces that are still relatively prevalent today. And as I've engaged in this work, I've really seen the power of the process of leadership and what happens when it can be expanded beyond a view of whiteness and individualism into collective action. And as Julie said, engaging with the head and heart and human skills that mean working with others and engaging through others. And I know this is sort of a later question, but thinking about the state of the world where we are right now, being able to hear and see people as humans, even if we have a differing perspective on whatever topic in which we're engaged. I think that is a really important and core part of leadership, is the humanizing nature of it. And so as I've engaged in this work, I think about that social change model also, Julie. And at first I'm like, gosh, this is so simple. Check, 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 7 C's, you create change. And as I have now been working with that model for 20 plus years, it is more complex. There's so much room for critique. There's so much room for updating and changing. And collaboration isn't as simple as creating consensus and coming together. So my thoughts around each of these theories and approaches has also evolved as I've gained and learned with and from folks engaged in this work. So Darren, I'll pass it to you.
I'm going to give an answer. I hope I'm not long-winded, Cam, but it's just that what Kristan and Julie said, there was a lot that spurred for me. And so my answer might be a little bit long-winded, but there's 3 things that I really think about is process, context, and positionality. I think it's really powerful that you talked about the word bossy, because in my mind, I think, well, I wonder if we change the way someone presents in terms of their gender, and would that same person be considered bossy, or would they be considered, assertive? And so we can't talk about leadership without identity. That's why I agree with what was said before. I think Kristan said that leadership is a process, absolutely. And it's context bound, because the way in which I activate leadership might be celebrated and exalted. Yet if Julie, Kristan do the same thing, it may be experienced differently. Or a white male counterpart employs leadership in their way, and they may be experienced differently than me. So context matters, and positionality. There are theories that I love, and then I sit in a dark room with a candle lit because that theory may not work for everyone. So I remember I was in class last fall, and we were doing authentic leadership. And authentic leadership is one of my favorite leadership theories. And so I said it in class. I was like, I really love authentic leadership. I shared my reasons and rationales. And then one of my students said, I don't feel the same way. And I said, tell me more, because I just think it's amazing, the best thing since sliced bread. And she said, as a woman here in the Clark School of Engineering, to show up in the ways in which this theory invites me, there's not a safety here for me to do that. And I really had to check myself, because there's identities that I hold of privilege that I have not even thought about those things. A piece of this is we got to engage everything with a level of criticality. Collaboration can't be talked about without culture and identity. Controversy with civility can't be talked about without culture and identity. All of these things are in context of identity. The other piece is that if we're looking at leadership theories as leadership educators, and we're not doing it with a level of criticality and honoring the context in which the theories were developed, then we are limited. For instance, servant leadership is wonderful, but Greenleaf's original work only utilized the pronoun he. That means a whole lot of people were left out of the lexicon of conversation when Greenleaf developed the theory. So servant leadership is the only thing you're employing in your leadership education, and you're not thinking about it from a critical lens. And it's like building a buffet for people, and the buffet was made full of meat, and half the people who are eating this are vegan. It's not going to be fully digestible. And if they do eat it, some of them are going to be intolerant to the food that you have prepared. So as leadership educators, as people who love leadership, we have to think about these things from a place of culture and context, because we want to have a leadership buffet that is celebratory of all. So again, for me, I think about this in the place of process, as Kristan talked about, in the place of context, and then the place of positionality, which within that, I think about identity.
I really appreciate that kind of analogy, right? There are so many opportunities. Yes, well said. There are so many opportunities to elevate folks of different identities and whatnot. And leadership isn't just, one thing. And I appreciate in all of your answers kind of this theme of identity and context and culture playing really significant roles in our leadership practices. And so, sort of with that in mind, kind of leaning into those themes, what are things that you're noticing and learning about leadership practices in today's world that you think are important to name, or maybe even stop doing, or things that you think are really powerful and we should do more?
Anyone want to take it? Kristan, you have to go first next time. No,
I know, I was like, I guess it's my turn to go first. There's so much, as Julie mentioned, leadership is such a fascinating and interesting topic because it's something that everyone feels that they're an expert in, and really none of us are. And I think for me, leadership invites us to stay curious and to continue to learn and grow about ourselves and others in the contexts and communities of which we're a part. And leadership debates are just so common in so many books and publications. Julie and I used to teach a class, and I often think about the airport reads that you actually don't need to read the book. You can just look at now the Wikipedia or then the back cover and understand the framework. And that's not to say that there's not value in those approaches to understanding and thinking about leadership. There certainly is. And when there are thousands of different approaches, it creates opportunity for disagreement, which actually is really important. And that's something that I'm thinking about and noticing in today's world. I feel that we're losing opportunity to engage in disagreement as a framework for creating new understanding and thinking about and across difference. What we know from the multi-institutional study of leadership that started at the University of Maryland in 2005 is that engagement around and about difference is the #1 predictor of socially responsible leadership. That is the biggest contributor to be able to engage in conversations across political ideology, religious ideology, a variety of different contexts, and help understand who we are and what we know. And that, for me, is an area that is a focus of how do I engage with folks with whom I disagree, whether that's about leadership or another topic, at the same time honoring folks' humanity in that process. And so creating space for those conversations.
Yes. Well, I think probably listeners, you all are picking up that we come from a sort of inclusive post-industrial approach to leadership. And as Kristan said, there are lots of people who don't agree with this approach. So we're trying to talk about something, but probably the dominant narrative in the world today is still leaders are charismatic individuals who get people to do their bidding, right? And some of you work for those people. And maybe that's why you're here, is listening for like how to deal with that boss that's very difficult. There are definitions that exist that say leadership requires a power differential, requires power over. And I think what we're all saying is that we can relanguage leadership to be more inclusive, and it can be something that's healing instead of committing violence on other people through hierarchy and power. I think I want to echo Kristan's point about people not talking to each other. I think that people are craving meaning making in the world today. I see it with my students. I've started to see more and more students, there's always students who maybe fail the class because they don't come, but I have a new trend that's happening at my university, which is students coming to class, loving the community, reading all the work, doing all the readings, but not necessarily turning in any work, right? But it was so important for them. They cared more about the community than they did about the grade, so it's an interesting thing. I think people are craving community and not sure how to find it. And there are some people writing about leadership as meaning making. William Draft did that back in the day. And I think if we can use leadership to help people find meaning and purpose in organizations and feel connected to resilient and values-based organizations, then we're doing a good thing. So that's what I'll say.
I think that when we think about what I'm noticing in leadership today, I can't talk about leadership without talking about mental health. And I think that sometimes we look at high involvement and we look at high engagement as an indicator of leadership, but sometimes high involvement and high trauma are going to hand in hand. And so I think we need to interrogate how we ask people, how are you doing? I think we need to interrogate the prototypes we consider of leadership. Certainly we consider them based on some traits and some identities, but one of the identities we need to say is that you can have anxiety and be a leader. You can suffer from depression or respond to depression and be a leader. That leadership and mental health can go hand in hand. And so acknowledging that, I think we are living in a world right now in the United States of America that is continually finding ways to politicize non-political issues. Intersectionality and critical race theory are not political constructs. They are constructs that I think can be great instruments for us to be able to make more inclusive practices. And so as educators, as researchers, as people who believe in these things, we need to approach the conversation in some ways, I feel like almost agnostic in terms of like, when I talk about intersectionality, I'm not talking about it being Democrat or Republican, being a political agenda issue. It's about sometimes you can't parcel out your identity of being working class and your ability status. Sometimes I can't parcel out my identity being Black and gay. They just come together and it's like pancake batter. You can't extrapolate the egg from the flour once they've been mixed together. That's neither here nor there. That's not values-based, it's just factual. So when I speak about leadership, when I speak about the importance of talking about intersectionality or critical theories in leadership, it's not from a place of trying to move you on some type of political agenda, but just trying to move you in terms of your understanding around leadership as a discipline. And then the third piece is, we have experienced a multitude of pandemics, and these pandemics have given me some space to reconsider how I think about who I put up as the forefront of leadership. So, I put my Abraham Lincoln, my Mahatma Gandhi, and my Martin Luther King, there we go. Let's have that as like the three trifecta of leadership. But now I'm sitting with, why didn't I have a Black woman who's an EMT from Lexington, Kentucky? Why didn't I have her as part of the people I put up as leadership? Because in this pandemic, Breonna Taylor was one of my greatest teachers and illuminators of leadership, and I had never met her, nor did she fit the prototype that I had been utilized in the past to celebrate what is and what isn't leadership. So I hope in these pandemics that we've experienced, social, economic, and certainly health-wise, that we begin to interrogate some of our practices and some of our considerations of who are those people who we put up as leaders. Certainly Gandhi and Martin Luther King and Abraham Lincoln, these are noteworthy figures, but there are noteworthy figures in our home communities, our neighbors down the street, the people who we volunteer with. We don't have to look far and wide to find the prototypes of great leadership that we need. And in some ways, those people are going to be much more relatable than some dead men who've been dead for, half a century or more.
Darren, can I add a comment about your mental health comment?
Yeah.
Your identity comments and power are so powerful. But I was just thinking about Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, and her decision to step down and the public backlash to that. Some of this is just to acknowledge that everything we're talking about today and the whole scholarship of leadership is really grounded in a Western sort of capitalistic approach to more and more and more. And so watching people be shocked that someone would say, I'm tired and I need a break from leadership, and watching sort of people casting aspersions on that decision instead of lifting it up as an example of what you're talking about, someone who's honoring sort of well-being and health in their leadership journey and who made a profound difference to their community. So anyway, I just want to throw that as a concrete example of what you're talking about.
And I mean, what she's doing in my mind is celebrating leadership. To say my tank is empty, I mean, that is so the antithesis of what we've been westernized to say. No, you keep going. Yeah, no, my tank is empty. And there's someone else who can take on this mantle and this torch and do it in a way that I just don't have the energy for. What a powerful thing to be able to say and to do. And she has a track record of leading in some really dynamic ways. And so why not honor that she's just fulfilling that track record by making this decision? I hope that people take some rich lessons from what she's doing in New Zealand.
I want to add and amplify all of this too, of how important it is to be able to show up in that vulnerability space of in this age of social media and Instagram, which I'm too old for, but the way that the performative nature of presenting what your leadership and life looks like, and then what that reality is, and how do we help normalize that what we see is not what we experience, and having folks be okay to cry in spaces and share their emotional vulnerability. And Susan David talked about not as a directive, but as a data point of what do we learn from ourselves when we show up in those emotions and not try to suppress them in ways that others are expecting someone to do when they show up to a space.
Yes, Kristan, I write about the intersections of gender and leadership, but I have a story that happened at Maryland with a supervisor where I was really angry at some injustice that occurred, and I burst into tears when I was telling them about this. And they said, oh, it's okay, they're there. And, they were comforting me as if I was sad or felt sorry. And I was like, no, this is how I show up when I'm angry. Like my tears are tears of anger. And so again, back to Darren about identity matters and perception. I think that sort of one example of what you're talking about.
And I appreciate this conversation, these perspectives, also the perspectives that are being shared in the chat as well. And I want to actually pivot away from maybe the questions that we had prepared and have you all maybe reflect for a moment or think about a time or a person kind of as Dr. Owen was sharing, like where your leadership practice was maybe challenged or something was, happening that was challenging for you, and who was a person that was there that kind of showed you that care, right? And challenged you and was a leader for you, and some of those qualities that they maybe demonstrated to kind of help you overcome maybe a situation or a challenge that you were facing. And really I'm asking that question so that we can have some more of those concrete examples of how perhaps we can support each other as leaders through some challenging times. I really appreciate that conversation earlier about the Prime Minister of New Zealand. Like, yeah, sometimes you just don't have it, and that's okay, and that should be okay. And so I would love to talk a little bit more about maybe what that care between each other can look like.
Well, I guess I would just add, as someone who's a giant talker, obviously an extrovert, and there is again the implicit assumption that extroversion and leadership are correlated, which is not true. Actually, scholarship shows. I would just say that listening is the most underrated leadership skill or ability, and so I'm constantly reminding myself to shut up and give space to others. Except for now, where I just jumped in again. Sorry, my co-panelists. But this idea, how do we make space for people to be authentic and to give their real reactions and make sure that is okay. That's part of a healthy workplace. So I would just say that that's a practice. I'm trying to cultivate humility and listening more in my leadership.
building off of what Julie shared, I'm a big fan of Brene Brown's Dare to Lead podcast. And at the end, she does her rapid fire questions. And she always asks, what's the leadership lesson the universe is teaching you over and over again? And for me, it's trust and patience, because I have neither. And so trying to cultivate that and to create this sort of psychological safety in the communities of which I'm part, to allow people to show up for how they are in that moment. And Kim, I was paused because your question was challenging, not because I haven't had those experiences, because I've had so many of them. And thinking about Julie and Darren as people that I have turned to in those moments where I felt like, gosh, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know how I ended up in this place. Who let me be in charge of this? I'm so upset that this decision is being made. I mean, I think about Julie when we were in LCSL and working together, and I was working with the service learning side, and there was a decision made that I just was so angry about and frustrated. I actually can't tell you what it was now, but I know I reacted really strongly. And yeah, I went to Julie's office, and she was there for me to help make meaning of why are you upset, and how do we what do you do with that reaction, and what does that mean?
I think before we all came together, I think I was sharing with Cam about when I came to Maryland many moons ago, and how I was asked about what my interests were, and I put Long Walks on the Beach and music by Janet Jackson. And then I got here and I realized that at the University of Maryland, College Park, Research One Institution, when they say interest, they meant research. And so you go and get this beautiful list of people and their beautiful interests, and then you get to me, it's like, oh, how fascinating. I've always been honest. And for the longest time, I thought my honesty was my liability, but it really is my source of power. And so when I am in a space like that moment, I was honest. That is my interest. It's my most salient interest. Long Walks on the Beach and music by Janet Jackson before anything else. I was in a room this summer and I was leading a conversation on criticality and leadership with a lot of leadership scholars. And I hadn't been in a room with that many people since the pandemic. And I was having like heart palpitations. And I just started off by saying, listen, I have anxiety. I haven't been in a room with this many people doing this work. So we're going to be here together for the next 90 minutes and we'll find our way through. I find that being honest is a great tool for me. And its best friend, its sibling is vulnerability. And so finding the space where trust has been showcased for me to be vulnerable and be myself. I found that that's been my greatest sense of support. When I was a doctoral student, I called Kristan because I was in the dark abyss. I'm like, I don't know how to find my way out. But the ability to find the community of people where I can be honest and I can be vulnerable, and honoring that people are not going to have their trust in me compromised because I spoke truth. Sometimes their confidence in me is compromised because I did. And so my honesty is my source of power, not my liability. And I think that's a helpful tool for me to employ, and maybe for others to consider when they're thinking about how to find their support systems in leadership, learning, growth, and development.
Darren, I just want to reflect about the value of trust in leadership. We knocked Stephen Covey, if you guys know Stephen Covey, back in the 80s, before you were born, wrote a book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. It was an early leadership text. It was kind of one of those airport books Kristan was talking about that really wasn't necessarily based on evidence-based practice in leadership. But he and his son wrote a book called Leadership at the Speed of Trust. So there was an inkling there. And I think that's important because trust people don't just give it to you. You have to earn it. And it takes time I'm going to use another Darren word, to marinate and to nurture trust. And so I do think, how do we teach leaders and people engaged in leadership? How do we teach them to foster trust and the things that break trust? I think that'd be an important skill set to take away.
We have this quote wall in LCSL where we just like write things that people say. And sometimes they're serious and sometimes they're not. And so I'm hoping that my colleagues that are here from LCSL are taking notes of some of the things that you all are saying so we can add them to our quote wall on a beautiful sticky note, and I will make sure that we give you due credit. But I really appreciate, these insights that you all are sharing. And so I want to give space to the audience now to ask questions that they might have. I know we have a couple that I can go ahead and get started and share. Let's see. So, and if you have questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. Our first question is, and we will slightly reword them just so that we can get through them as quickly as possible, so everyone has an opportunity to ask questions. But our first one is from Rachel, who asks, how might one navigate a culture or structure that is fearful of honesty and vulnerability and does not encourage it?
This kind of goes back to what we were talking about, and maybe this is controversial. You don't have to stay in all of those spaces. And so recognizing, what is important to you in an organization or community, and how do you find off ramps, and sometimes that's an easier choice than others. There are certainly economic and other considerations for why one may not be able to exit a space, but then there are other I think opportunities to find and create spaces that do support that honesty and vulnerability, that can help be a support for that. And we don't have to make spaces fit us because of the work that it might take to do that. Certainly that is not always the case. But it can be exhausting and harmful and traumatic to always be the truth teller in a space. And when I've had those experiences, I have spoken my truth. I have advocated and tried to create the space for that to be part of the culture. And there's sometimes enough resistance that I want to not engage in that further. So I think there's some privilege in that, of course, but we do all have choice. Another podcast that I like listening to is the Homecoming podcast by the former president of the American Psychological Association. And she had a whole session on sort of toxic environments and how do you manage them when you feel stuck. And part of that is, where do you find community and space that is not that? And so how do we think about our identities and how we show up and try and create some buffering from that toxicity potentially?
Yeah, I mean, it leads me to think of the quiet quitting movement, where you don't actually quit your job, you just do the bare minimum. Like, if your organization doesn't invest in you, you're not going to invest in them. And so I think that's such a fascinating phenomenon that people are engaging in. I like what Kristan said about, are there places you can make a space that's more healthy and nurturing? There's this language of hierarchy in leadership research that says, you can be within a very powerful hierarchy and still find collaborative spaces within that. And so where are the spaces that you can create communities of trust? Some people become the blocker and they take on all of the organizational stress and then buffer everyone below them in the hierarchy. Those people are heroes and saints in my book, but that has a psychological toll for sure as well. So yeah.
Oh my goodness, I just did everything that has already been said. I guess if I was just to offer something else, even though I don't know if there's much to offer, I would say, if just to Chris's point, if it's not fitting, leave. And then there's the magic of when you might be able to make some change happen. So for example, my best friend, Michelle LaVaughn Robinson Obama, okay? We've been best friends in my mind for a long, long time. She served as the First Lady of the United States for 8 years. Oh, I have my bobblehead up here, but I was gonna bring it down, but I'll just let it be. Then she writes her book, Becoming. And she talks about her first boyfriend, Reggie, and how they used to smoke weed together. And then she writes her second book and says that I'm going to go out on my tour and I'm going to wear my hair in braids. It's a hair restorative way to wear her hair. It's the way she wants to wear her hair. She's giving you 8 years of who Michelle Obama is. She's built a rapport with you and a trust with you where now she has agitated the space to the point where now she can show up more authentically. She can say that there are things that are happening in the previous administration that could not have happened in the Obama administration because her husband was a shade of brown, that this country would not accept certain things from him. She can say that on national TV in a space that 12 years ago, people would not found fathomable. And she would have said the things in her truth in both of her books that she would have said 12 years ago. It would have been problematic to say that she had low-grade depression during the pandemic. We needed Michelle Obama to move through that experience of 8 years and not quit. We needed her face to be the face of the First Lady for 8 years. So now she can utilize that platform to do a whole lot of things that she probably wanted to do then, but needed to build a political cachet with people to do. So if you're working in an environment like my best friend, where if you stay there and stay the course, and it's not to the emotional, psychological detriment of you, then there may be a powerful opportunity for you in your own metaphorical Michelle LaVaughn Robinson way to agitate the space to be a little bit different, or to invite conversations in the space that look a little bit different. And I just think, but you have to discern that for yourself. And not me nor anyone else can tell you that that's to do, because it's a lot of work and it's a lot of emotional labor. And nobody should invite you to do that without you considering for yourself if the benefit is there, the cost benefit analysis is there to do it.
Thank you for sharing that. And that kind of leads into our next question of what are some of those resources that you might suggest for leaders, and no matter where they are, maybe in their career or leadership practice, is there a particular book that you really love or a podcast that someone might be able to engage with to kind of continue to elevate their leadership practices?
I've jumped in first a couple of times, Julie. So now it's back to you or Darren.
Okay. Well, the book that changed my life most recently about leadership is Helena Liu, Liu. It's Redeeming Leadership. And it's a little bit academic. It's not like, a beach read, right? But the Helena says that, we still romanticize leadership as this charismatic, benevolent individual. And yet really, those folks can still perpetuate and enact colonizing, racist, economic, and gendered violence on people. And so she asked the powerful question, can and should leadership be redeemed? Or are we really talking about, do we need something else, another kind of name for what we're doing here? And so it's provocative from beginning to the end. And so it's got a feminist twist. Anyway, I highly recommend. It's called Redeeming Leadership. I'll put it in the chat.
I'm going to give a plug for Julie and Darren's beautiful books, and thinking about those as resources and thinking about leadership and expanding notions of leadership, because I know they won't share that themselves. I listen to a lot of podcasts, and I'm someone that I think all of us, right? Like once you get a red sweater, then you see red sweaters everywhere, whatever it might be. But once I started to engage with leadership, I started to see it everywhere. And so books, movies, television shows, speeches, I think there's opportunities to learn about leadership in every context in which we are. I am personally a big fan of Brene Brown's Dare to Lead podcast. And then a lot of the folks that she brings on there have books and resources and learning to engage with there. I also like Adam Grant's work around Think Again. That's been really important to me in engaging in that curiosity and staying curious and sort of leading with curiosity. And the Homecoming podcast by Dr. Thema is actually a counseling podcast. It's not necessarily a leadership focus, but there have been some really important messages there that have been helpful. And then I am listening to Michelle Obama's most recent book, and I think there are a lot of great lessons there as well. So those are just a few, but I'm sure I feel like when I first came to Maryland, I remember going to Craig Slack's office that had all of these books. And I was like, well, to engage in leadership, I need to go buy a lot of books. And so I did. some of them better than others, but I do feel like I have a whole bookshelf full of resources that have been helpful to me, and love to gain others from folks who are here. I imagine that folks who have joined us could also add many to the chat to share collectively as well.
I ditto that invitation for people to share in the chat. I love good books. I will say this, and I'll tell you a book that I think is one to consider adding. As I hope with all these books and with theories, because I meant to say this earlier, you mix and match. Take the social change model and throw in a little bit of like something else in it, like and deconstruct and reconstruct. I think that's the most powerful way to get things from it, because everyone is limited. I still do love Sheryl Sandberg, and then I had to juxtapose Sheryl Sandberg with someone else whose identities look different, whose lived experiences look different, to illuminate that Sheryl Sandberg's truth is her truth, and her truth is limited because it is hers. And so I'm going to give you a book, and we're going to give you books, but they're going to be limited based on the perspectives and positionality of the authors, similar to the theories that we utilize. So like these books, mix and match, take a piece of this, take a piece of that. And like theory, take a piece of this and take a piece of that. The book I would offer is Carol Dweck's Mindset, The New Psychology of Success. It's an oldie but goodie, and I think it's a continual invitation about where are we? Are we in a fixed mindset, or are we in a growth mindset? And so Carol Dweck's book and a good journal where you journal your thoughts around things that are happening in your day-to-day life. I think those are two great resources for anyone who's endeavoring in leadership education and learning.
I just added the Jordan and Kezar. We keep talking about this model. If you're not familiar with the social change model, there's a million online resources and videos to connect with. But there's been updates to it to say that it didn't talk about, especially some of those things Darren was bringing to the forefront about equity, inclusion, and power and leadership. And so people have tweaked it. And I think there's a new, better, I don't want to put better, I think better version out there. And that's a free resource that people can access.
Thank you all for sharing that with us. We have one more question just to kind of wrap us up today. But if you had to share just like one thing that you feel like everyone who practices leadership should know, and I know just one thing that's really hard, but what would that thing be?
I guess I would, one thing I see, especially new leaders, people newer to leadership do, that's just a comment. I just was on this trip and had this saw this in action. I think people get anxious and they think they have to have the answers. Leaders are people who are experts and they must know everything. And that is just the antithesis of what you should be doing. It leads you down a really dark road if you think leaders go in their office, shut the door, and make the decisions, right? So like whatever you need to do to get over this idea that you have to have a specific kind of expertise. Now, that expertise is valued. We need expertise in leadership, but you don't have to have all of the expertises to do leadership. So how do we teach people how to find expertise, how to evaluate expertise, how to be inclusive of others' ideas, and make sure you're constantly sort of checking the temperature of the group's wishes, because most people don't complain. They just sit silently and drop out, right? So we need people to surface kind of group feeling and people's own sort of commitments and say to shared vision making. So you don't have to have all the answers, but you need to know how to create an environment where people contribute to creating a shared vision.
Yes, Julie, amplify, agree. And I think adding to that, how do you stay curious and approach different ideas or perspectives with humility and curiosity and a growth mindset, to loop back to Carol Dweck. So for me, building off of what Julie said, and I'm sure what Darren will say, but staying curious and knowing you don't have to have all the answers in this process.
I would say your voice matters, and don't limit the context of your voice and where it can be beneficial. I'd share the story often that a couple of years ago, I was asked to do a leadership presentation for Pillsbury. There was a business professor who typically did it, but was not able to. And so they were like, well, Darren can do it. And I was like, no, I can't, because I don't do that. I do leadership in a classroom with students in a higher education forum. And they were like, no, let's try it. And the Pillsbury experience was really illuminating to remind me that voice doesn't have to be confined to one space. The way you speak about leadership can be transferable to other spaces. So your voice matters. The distinctions of your voice, your distinct perspectives, they matter. And then don't limit the context in which you contribute of your voice, because you may surprise yourself in the process.
Thank you for those responses. I know we have another question. I appreciate Kristan for responding, and Julie as well. But I think, we're almost at time. So I do want to just take a moment to say thank you so much to the three of you for sharing your time and your expertise, especially over your lunch hour. I hope that you get some time to get some fuel in after this. And I want to say thank you so much to the Alumni Association for giving us a platform to be able to have this conversation today. And thank you to the Career Week sponsors, which are Terps Card and American Pacific Mortgage Company. Without their support, we wouldn't be able to be here as well. A recording of this webinar is going to be sent to the email addresses you used to sign up. I encourage you to connect with our panelists today. If you want some more information, of course, they all have amazing publications and research, every single one of them. So I definitely encourage you to read up on some of the things that they write about and think about, because they are amazing scholars who have great insights. So thank you everyone again for joining us today. We hope to see you at another event this week, and have a wonderful day. Go Terps!